Loading. Maybe? Okay, it's still loading. This is the start of every stream I've ever done. You have to be like, are we live? Are we here? Okay, cool, we are live. So, hi there. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bear, and we are on The Magic of Today, which is the contemporary fantasy panel for the virtual indie book fest. This was created by Paula, who you can find in the description downstairs, and it's meant to celebrate indie, small press, and self-published authors. So, like I said, today we're going to be talking about contemporary fantasy. And if you all just want to go down the line and introduce yourself, your name, pronouns, your most recent release, and a fun fact about yourself.
Sure. Should I go first? I think I'm first on the lineup. I don't know if we all see the same thing.
Yes. Yeah.
No problem.
Okay. So I'm Amber Fisher. I live in Austin, Texas, and I write urban fantasy and paranormal mysteries. My most recent series is called the Rest in Power Necromancy series, and the first book in that series is called Temple of the Inner Flame. So that's what I'll be talking about today. My fun fact is I studied Japanese, and back in 2018, I took a proficiency exam offered by the government of Japan that certified I can speak Japanese as well as about a 2-year-old. So that's me. Really happy to be here. So yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm Sarah Coder. I live on a lake up in Massachusetts, and I write a variety of genres, including urban fantasy. My latest urban fantasy series is the Evenstar Chronicles, which follows a non-binary teenage demon hunter who is trying to stop an apocalypse. And a fun fact about myself, I've been very into open water swimming, and I try to swim between half a mile to a mile a day.
Hey, hi, everyone. My name is Terea. I go by TR Tells. I am a urban fantasy author with a dabbling of epic fantasy. My recent books that came out was the Paragons of Justice series, which was book 2, Her Dark Virtue. Can't speak for right now, but I guess a fun fact about myself would be that I have like a sort of clairvoyancy sort of thing where I can just tell what may or may not happen for specified persons or items 10 seconds to several minutes, and I already know that's going to happen. So, hi everyone.
That's pretty cool. I'm Celeste Harte. I live in Catalonia, Spain, actually. I go by she, her pronouns, and my most recent release is Rising. Actually, I have it right there. It's the latest book in my Dragonbone series, which is kind of like sci-fi and fantasy mixed together. I just like bashing genres. A fun fact about me, I am learning Korean just for fun. And so that I can get to the point where I can watch my K-dramas without subtitles. So.
I'm Elizabeth Wambheim. I usually go by E. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I write asexual love stories kind of across the genres, but I really like fantasy. And this is my first foray into urban fantasy with Of the Wild. My fun fact is I've never been able to beat the Wind Waker Legend of Zelda game because it is too scary.
All right, awesome. So the first thing I want to dive into is we're going to talk about the craft of writing a contemporary fantasy. And one thing that I, as a reader, am always very interested in is world building. So how do each of you figure out the perfect blend for your books of fantastical elements and real world elements? How do you make that work in a way that works best for you?
When we do these, do you want us to just go in order, or should we just speak out?
Yeah, yes, we'll just go down the line.
Okay, sorry. All right. So for me, so I write primarily urban fantasy, but the fantasy aspect is actually very secondary in my work. I appreciate the speculative aspect of fantasy, which allows readers to ask, what if that really did happen, or what if that really could happen? So, for example, the premise of my first book, Temptation in the Flame, is the idea that Black people in diaspora receive gifts of magic from their ancestors in order to kind of even the playing field against, systemic racism and things like that. And so I wanted that to be a poignant theme, which I didn't want distracted by, werewolves at the grocery store or, sylphs running around causing chaos. And so the magic is pretty minimal, except for where that element of the ancestral magic comes in, or where we're talking about the actual, the mystery at play. There's always some kind of magic, secret magic in the mystery. But for me, that was really important, was to keep the magic and the fantastic as minimal as possible, so that when it does come up, it really catches your attention and really makes you think, what if that really were possible?
With my Evanstar Chronicles, I made the magic more prominent, but I like when I write contemporary fantasy, I like taking real places and real things and just making them magical. Like I also tend to give my characters too many powers sometimes, but I like to but then I try not to let the fantasy overpower like other things though, because I do delve into a lot of like mental health themes in my book, so I do make sure I leave room for plenty of character development. But usually I picture a place and I'm like, what magical thing might my character encounter like in this place, and I try to like integrate the setting and the magic, and it's like building the world is more like what magical elements like from fairy tales, from other books and different tropes and stuff that are sticking in my head, and what would it be like if these things were showing up on my favorite beach or something.
So I guess how I balance the fantastical and real world is by blending them basically together. How both Amber and Sarah basically had just said. So take my book, Her Dark Sins, for example. I'll just briefly just show this right here. People go through trauma and being bullied or harassed every single day. There's always some jerk being homophobic, or a person just going through some sort of difficult problem in their life, and either people just brush it off and be like, well, just get over with it, it'll be okay, or they don't listen, nor do they understand how difficult it is. And because of that, it results in a range of emotions, usually fear and sadness and anger. And so I thought to myself, well, what if those particular emotions manifested and they took over, okay, and control of us, and they became actual like demons, monsters. So those anger feelings and everything literally results into just creatures that just lurk over you, controlling you, seeping your energy. And lost my train of thought there. But most of my books take place in real life and making it relatable, and pulling people to basically like see, well, hey, I kind of get that. Or if they were kind of a jerk to somebody, they can be like, oh, well, that's how you kind of felt, I didn't know. Or at least, I mean, I can't take from like even the jerks who are being homophobic, they'll be like that, sadly. But hopefully the awareness of it all will make people just be like, wow, imagine if that were to actually happen.
For me, I think the way that I blend two elements is basically kind of just by looking at, I feel like one of the two things that are most important to our society as it is right now, which is like lifestyle and culture. And I really feel that with adding different elements to things, you can definitely look for ways to incorporate it in the character's lifestyle and culture. So for me, blending fantasy and contemporary or sci-fi or however way you want to look at it, definitely had to do with making sure that those elements were present in the character's culture and or lifestyle. So it often popped up, and that's also, I feel like, a good way to not have the reader feel overwhelmed with too much information, because you don't explain how your phone works when you use it. You just use it. So I try to look at the way that the characters interact with their world the same way. They're just going to use the things that are normal to them at that point, because it is, and that's just my way of doing it.
So for me, I like to use magical aspects to kind of highlight and reinforce characters' personal journeys. So, for example, in Of the Wild, the main character's magic and where it comes from and why it's fading are all tied into what he needs to learn about himself and how he needs to grow as a person. And so it's a case-by-case, kind of story-by-story basis where I look at the balance of what is going to help me tell the story I want to tell, what is going to be something I want to include for atmosphere, and then what do I need to keep from the real world so that readers are grounded and have a place for their feet to land. And since it's a case-by-case basis, it kind of depends on how aware are people of magic, or is this something that's new to them? Is this something that's kind of integrated into their culture and their lifestyle, to use Celeste's words? But for the most part, I really like to use magic to kind of add on to what we know about people and to kind of make visible the psychology behind their decisions.
Awesome. That's all really interesting. Continuing to talk about craft, right? When it comes to writing, what's been the most difficult or the most fun scene for each of you? You can answer both, or you can pick one, whichever one works best for you. But in your books, which one? What's the scene that really sticks out as being, challenging?
I definitely have two answers. So I have one for each. The most challenging is early on in the book. My main character suffers through a pretty violent assault. But I am not really interested in being graphic, or that's not my focus. I don't want to shock you on the page or whatever. So I had to write a very fine balance between sharing enough of what happens to explain why she makes the decisions that she does, because that's sort of the catalyst for the rest of the story, without being gratuitous. And I also wanted to make sure that I was being respectful for people who maybe have suffered through such an attack, or been mugged or something like that. So I don't have a trigger warning in the book. Someone told me recently that maybe I should consider it. So it's something I'm thinking about. But for the most fun aspect of the book was one of the characters hosts, or she has a magical shop. And on the first draft, when I wrote it, it was basically like the magical version of Target, it was just very bland and, fluorescent lights, whatever. And on my second draft, I was like, this is a novel. Like, you can make it be whatever you want it to be. Like, it doesn't have to be Target. And so I took her into a Gothic church in Los Angeles, and I made it super dark and creepy. And we added taxidermy owls and, preserved, bats and whatnot in jars. And I was like, this is so much more fun. And so just creating that atmosphere, that creepy atmosphere of a magic shop that I wish really existed, like in Austin, like that I could go to and with my creepy, weird friends. And so that was super fun for me, was that just creating an atmosphere that I wish I had access to in real life.
I would say for me, what's actually it's the most fun and it's the most difficult is writing some of the battle scenes in the books, particularly the final one at the end of Power Inversion, which is the second book in the series, because I always can see these fight scenes in my head, like if I'm driving and have music on, like I see them like a movie, like kind of zoomed out from but I really am only writing from one character's point of view. So I love imagining them, but then when it comes time to actually get them on the page, especially like that in Power Inversion, there's like this almost epic battle at the end, and trying to figure out okay, I can't show everything because I'm in tight first person, so and I always struggle with the blocking. My beta readers always get confused about who's where, and there's also throughout the book, a lot of it is really tied to the character's personal emotional journey. So I have to keep in a lot of that kind of comes to a kind of an aha moment for the character, like within the battle. So it's a challenge to take like step away from like the visual, cinematic version of this fight that I have in my head, and then write it in a way that the reader can follow, and where there's a really good balance of like emotion and internal thought paired with enough description so the readers can see the action. And I have so much fun doing it, but it's also so hard to get the right balance between the physical action and the emotion, and really keeping it tight from that one character's point of view.
Mentioning that, I would actually say that would probably be the most difficult too. I always have like these music playing in my head, be like, okay, this is how I want the scene to go. It's gonna be like this, that. But then when I get to it, just like, ooh, how was that supposed to go again? But I guess besides that, most difficulty will be writing certain things that might happen to my characters that affect them mentally. Both even in my epic fantasy, a character of mine gets raped, and writing that scene kind of just like I had to take several breaks, because that kind of like delved into my psyche a little bit, and I'm just having like, okay, let me just pause. And even though it does work for the good and bad for her, it was still a lot taken. And I know that there are other people who actually have been through that. And I just didn't want to like step on any toes or anything. And even with her Dark Sins, the first book, she goes through so much. My character, Kira Knight, basically like it just delves into her psyche with like the shooting, mainly from her father's death, that not only pushed her to actually try to fight for justice, but it also weighs heavily on her psychologically. So that I realized really like takes an impact on myself when writing. And even my editors were just saying for book 2, for certain other things that were in it, that I should put trigger warnings. And I've started doing that in recent later books as well, because there are some issues that a lot of people when they read, they don't want to just be like hit in the face without being warned. Besides that darkness and everything, I probably should attach, grim dark fantasy is also attached to that fantasy that I like. But the most fun that I like to do is the power-ups. I am a big anime fan, and most of my inspiration comes from anime. Like the last scene in her Dark Sins came from My Hero Academia, where he was fighting basically um, um, Overhaul, and that was kind of the most. Lost my train of thought there. I'm sorry. That was where the idea came from, and so a lot of it, stems from different kinds of anime, mainly anime.
It's fun. I would say that the hardest scenes for me are almost always at the end, because it's just like I have so much going through my head at that time. And like, I don't know, endings are kind of special for me. So I kind of always want to make sure that the ending feels special for my readers. Just like, I love a good, satisfying ending that just like ties up all the loose ends and makes it feel complete. So I kind of put a lot of pressure on myself towards the end. So those are always the hardest scenes, but it's the most rewarding when it comes out well. One of my favorite scenes in Rising in particular is a moment where my two main characters, which are also love interests, kind of make themselves vulnerable to each other at one point, whereas they kind of have been led by like a lot of things that happened to them and things that they had to do. And I really like that scene because I feel like it's where they really take the reins of their story and decide where it goes from that point on. And they really take um, like, I don't know, agency at that point, I think, where they just kind of take command of like where they're going in the direction with their relationship, with their story, with their plot. And I really feel like it's an empowering moment for both of those characters because I don't know, I feel like it's something that we can all relate to, where there's like a lot of times you go through like a lot of stuff that happens and then, you know, you're just kind of reacting to it. But sometimes you get those really like crucial moments where you actually take the reins and start deciding for yourself what happens from then on. So that was a really important scene to me.
The most difficult scenes for me to write tend to be the kind of emotional finale of a story. And so, for example, in Of the Wild, and this isn't a spoiler to say, I promise, the main character, Eris, spends a lot of time not admitting that he's scared and sad and like very, very deeply exhausted. And so there's a scene near the end where that finally cracks, and that kind of the moment where he has to let someone see him for who he is kind of finally happens. And the whole story has kind of been building and building and building to that point. And so it was really hard to stick the landing and make sure that I got the pacing right and like the emotional nuance right and the conversation happening between the two characters right. And kind of how folks have already been talking about it, like it's very difficult to write hard scenes like that. It's also very satisfying. And like once you get it, it feels really good to have gotten it. The most fun that I had was any scene that I got to write for the like horde of goblin children that Eris has. I spent a year as a reading tutor for elementary school students, and every time I wrote a scene where the goblins are like playing or saying weird nonsense, like I got to channel the very chaotic enthusiasm of like the elementary school class that I tutored, and I was like, I really miss these kindergartners. They were so weird. Hope they're doing well. But that was a really rewarding scene to write.
I don't know, now you guys just have like anime going in my head. Like now I just want to chat about anime instead. So moving off of like craft and technical stuff, I want to talk more about like what it's like to write in this specific genre and particularly like the reception of it. So what do you think about like the recent resurgence and enthusiasm for contemporary fantasy? Because I feel like in recent years we've really seen the genre take off more. So how does it feel like to be on the receiving end of that?
So I mean, I don't know, because I don't really feel like it ever went anywhere. I feel like fantasy has always been very, very popular, especially, you know, on TV shows. We had Supernatural and we had Buffy and we had Charmed and we have so many, you know, supernatural shows and shows that I think represent our genre really well. And I think, you know, being in urban fantasy, I think there's so many opportunities and there's so many ways that we can blend so many different tropes and themes. And I think it's always fresh. And what I really appreciate is, you know, the people have been receptive to the fact that I don't tend to write worlds where there's a lot of, you know, shapeshifters and vampires, and because we got a lot of vampires for a while. And I personally got kind of was like, I OD'd on vampires a little bit. But so I was worried when I first published my series that people were going to be like, what, you know, why is there not more monsters or whatever? But I think people actually appreciated the way that I approached it. And I think that I owe a lot to those who have gone before, because there have been a lot of different ways to write and talk about urban fantasy. You know, the first writer that I really remember reading was Charles Gallant. And by today's standards, Charles Gallant is almost not even urban fantasy, even though he in some ways is kind of the father of the genre. But we've moved so far into this very violent or action-oriented, you know, in-your-face magic kind of situation. But I'm noticing that readers are still receptive to a gentler, less, you know, more like sensitive kind of magic and kind of experience. So that's kind of how I feel. I feel like there's room for all of this, and I find that very exciting and very fulfilling.
I mean, sometimes I try not to think too much about what's popular in the market and what isn't when I'm writing, because if I do, I get fixated on it and then I start worrying, oh, is this going to sell? Is this going to sell? And then I find myself trying to tailor things to a certain audience. And then by the time the book is actually done and ready to be published, the market's moved on to something else. Like it changes so quick, and that if like something does, you know, and there's always different elements of contemporary fantasy or urban fantasy. Maybe like the shifter, like vampires, werewolves went out of trend for a while, but then you have quieter urban fantasy books or contemporary fantasy where there's magic, but not, not shapeshifters or something, or witches will get popular for a while. And, so there's all different subgenres of contemporary fantasy. And I think which one is popular at any given time changes, but there's always something that is contemporary in fantasy that's there. And I feel like trying to follow the market too closely, just like it actually hinders my writing. So I just write, and then if something's done and it's not the right market for it, then I can always save that, and eventually that thing's going to come back. So.
Oh, speaking of that, I'm going to talk about anime briefly again. Sorry, Bear. So I feel that same kind of way, even with how anime, how everyone's just like, oh, I like this, or hey, I like that, and everything, and everyone's always butting their heads that what's best, and just like, oh, well, this is better because this, and this is better because that. And the same thing can go with even just fantasy. Oh, well, urban fantasy is obviously superior. Oh no, well, this fantasy is always superior. And I feel like in recent kind of ways, like how you said, it didn't go anywhere, but also what Sarah just said, that it fluctuated every so often, and people were just like, well, I'm tired of vampires, hey, let's get into this, or but everything has its own version of the story. And I feel like it all does matter and means something, because that's how we actually create newer concepts and newer things, and we get to actually make contemporary fantasy, epic fantasy, all kinds of fantasies better and stronger. And I think even the resurgence, even though it didn't necessarily go anywhere, it got stronger. So I think because of nowadays, when I go into a bookstore or just hear people talking, there's a lot more people talking about several indie authors publishing books, and they're actually broadcasting it out, local authors everywhere. So I feel like that made it generally just stronger. And I also feel that the more inclusion of representation, especially Black main characters, like myself, and they're they're not just doing the simple things of, well, you're Black, so you obviously have to just do urban. You obviously have to be just in an urban environment, gunslinging, listening to rap music, playing basketball and stuff like that. Obviously, or even just the same thing with just different, like being different races, where people have their stereotypes. We all know what those stereotypes are. And I feel like now that there's actually more of a brandishing where now such said character can do, you know, fight vampires, slay dragons, ride dragons. And I feel like now the inclusion of it all is what technically matters. Um, and and it's all while balancing relationships, where now they can, simply, hey, look, lie to their parents because they have to go around the corner to the magical shop or whatever, or they have to basically just go into like a simply another world and everything. They have to miss out on school or classes, and there's just different varieties of things that now is different than the usual, and we can have a plethora of things now. It's not just the simple, even though again the simple is kind of what started it, but I feel like it just got stronger now.
And you said Black people riding dragons. I'm just like, hey. But I definitely agree with what a lot of you have said. Like, I think, like, especially my experience, like being a Black female author, like, you kind of have to go in understanding what the market is like, but you also have to go in just making your own lane, Like, you can't just go in not you can't go in expecting that there's going to be a slot already there for you. You got to bust it open. So but at the same time, I do feel like when you go in and you go in without really worrying about what the current trends are, and you find out that you're not the only one looking for these things. Most times, there is an audience just like you that is also looking for, Black people riding dragons, and even like Amber was talking about, like a gentler kind of fantasy. I think a lot of people are looking for a certain escapism that's easy to understand, and it's not necessarily in a big old complicated world that they have to learn all these rules in, like a big Tolkien book. It's a lot easier to understand. Like, it happens in a world that they're familiar with, and it just has a little bit of magic that gives them that little bit of escapism. But I think, again, it comes from making your own lane and then finding the people that are like you.
Everyone's said everything already so perfectly. I think that the wider variety of authors does make the genre more appealing to more people, and I think that the diversity really is a key point of it. And I think too, just the ease with which we can find new books, and like how many people now are aware of like diverse authors and a diverse audience, and they're really trying to connect those two pieces together. I do think genre elitism is still a thing, but I also think people are less self-conscious now about what they love, especially with things like anime and like supernatural kind of going more mainstream. I think it's less cringy to be into fantasy stuff. And then I think I think kids and teens have always had fantasy books, and I don't think that societally we're weaning them off of them as much as we used to. And so I think it's more acceptable now for like young adults and adults to like really openly enjoy fantasy as a genre.
All right. And piggybacking off of that, because I like what you said about how it's not as like cringy anymore to like nerdy things. In the past, there's been this stigma associated with like enjoying contemporary fantasy or urban fantasy. And as someone who makes content around books and is in like the reader side of it, I see the stigma a lot more. So like, how do you go about like not letting that get in your head when you're writing? And just like kind of like saying fuck all of that.
That's exactly what I do. It's very much a fuck all of that. I'm 45 years old. I don't care what other people have to say or think anymore. Like, I spent so much of my life worrying about that, and I'm finally in a place where I really truly, and I say this to anybody who's young and who doesn't know, like, you get to a point where you really do love yourself, and you really do, you're like, this is who I am. And I'm not going to change. I'm going to try to keep getting better, and I'm going to keep evolving, but I am done pleasing people. And so there was honestly, there was never a moment where I was worried about the fantasy aspect of what I was writing. To piggyback on something Celeste said, I was worried about the fact that I write, my first series is very Black. It's a Black main character. It's all about Blacks get magic, nobody else. And I was worried. I was like, this could go either way. Like, this could really be, people could love this or people will hate it. And which doesn't mean that one precludes the other, but I was worried about that. I was like, am I going to launch my sort of debut series and be seen and pigeonholed as a Black writer? And that was something I struggled with, because while I don't want to be pigeonholed, even though I want to speak to a specific audience who I do think has been underserved, I want to be able to tell any kind of story I want at any time. And so, someone mentioned earlier, how diversity, I think it was E mentioned that diversity really has allowed more people to access fantasy and more writers to tell their stories. I really think that I got lucky that I started to write or started to publish in a time when we are really embracing diversity and Black Lives Matter. And we're really starting to talk about how bringing those voices really does matter, and it makes a difference to readers, to children, to society. So for me, it's not about fantasy. It was definitely about embracing my heritage and the diverse aspect that I wanted to bring to my stories, and being unafraid and unapologetic about who I'm speaking to and how I decided to speak to them.
I feel like the stigma of urban fantasy, it affected me when I was younger, when I was in college, and then because I took a couple of creative writing classes where the teacher was very like focused on, he was very into like literary fiction. It was always trying to tell me, oh, your stories would be better if you just took the magic out of them. And I think, and then like this was back in like 2007, 2008 or something, when Twilight was big, and some other person in my class was like, "Oh, your book is just another Twilight," and I'm like, "My book is nothing like Twilight. There's no vampires in it. There's, it's like a completely different, this, but but it does have like a lot of YA urban fantasy, some YA urban fantasy tropes. Like it has a romance subplot, it has monsters, it has demons, it has people discovering new powers. But that like pushback I had against it when I was in college actually just made me want to write fantasy more, and prove them wrong and be like, screw you, I'm going to write what I want and it's going to be good. And I ended up, not writing for a few years because I was so busy when I went, with the rest of college, with graduate school, with starting, entering the workforce, that it was a few years, it was a while before I really actually got serious about writing as an adult. And when I did, that stigma really, it just didn't occur to me anymore. If anything, the thing that I was more worried about was when I started publishing books, I was writing characters that use they, them pronouns. And I was more afraid of readers like complaining about the pronouns than about the urban fantasy. And in one of my novellas, I did have the first one that I wrote from third person with they, them pronouns. I had some reviewers that were like brutal about like, complaining about how confusing it was and misgendering characters. And when I write in first person, though, that doesn't really, they don't always notice it, but I have to just ignore those readers because they're not the ones my book is for. They're not my audience. So I just have to, say, what, maybe the more characters I write like this, the more eventually people are going to be more accepting of it, and those people aren't who my book is for. So just, and the same thing, if people complain about urban fantasy or don't like it, well, they're not my readers. Screw that, I don't care what they think. And I do write other genres too. Like I write science fiction. I've written a little bit of like fantasy. I don't know if I call it epic, but so I do write across like different genres and for different age groups. So if I do get too like worried about one genre, I just switch to one of my others. But I try not to. I haven't really thought much about the urban fantasy stigma since I was in college. So, and it just made me want to read it more.
And I guess speaking just from both of what y'all were saying, I do think that it does have something to do with the ones before, where people are always saying, every so often you'll always hear, and I especially hear, well, maybe you might be the next J.K. Rowling. We won't, say anything about, that. But maybe, you'll be the next George R.R. Martin, or hey, maybe you'll be, the next Tolkien or something, or maybe this and that and that, or oh no, this looks like the Hunger Games, or oh no, this looks like this, and it kind of just it brings people down because you're not trying to either copy or this, and it is hard sometimes, because like if you kind of like think about, well, I want to do a society where basically everyone's separate into a faction, and they're kind of like separated by race or whatever. Well, that sounds like the Hunger Games. Well, I mean, not really, and I feel like that has kind of pushed the stigma a little bit. And not only that, but the fact that I guess in a way, I myself didn't get. I'm almost 29 years old, and I feel like I didn't just get actually serious with writing until maybe like few some years ago. But I've always had people, and even just people of my own skin color, were just like, well, I don't see how police brutality is a thing, or like, well, this isn't true, or whatever, or what do you do? I'm just like, what do you mean? Like, do you not see everything that is going on? And with the recent death of George Floyd, that and the resurgence and how everybody was just like, they spoke out and everything. That was kind of right around the time where Her Dark Sense was kind of like, it was born before that. And I was just like, this is what I'm talking about, And how simply people need to simply just be aware of what's actually going on in societies and other genres, and that it's simply more than just, well, not that there's anything wrong with even enemies to lover, any other trope. There's nothing wrong with any of the tropes, but don't um hit anyone down because, well, it's not like that. Because you can still read those general, other books. They're still there. It's just that there are simply other books now for different readers now who kind of want to see that, who simply want to just be like, well, being in love with a vampire and having like, a werewolf fight with me is cool and everything, but I kind of want to see now, like, hey, I want to be the master of the universe or something, or I want to know how it actually generally feels to kind of like being a character where I simply don't see myself as, a female or male, or I don't necessarily want to stick to the general pronouns that society has said I have to be. That's why even I'm still trying to kind of like take a deep breath and just say, just it all, and be like, well, no, I'm writing this because this is what actually matters to me and probably other people. I even have a portal fantasy, a middle grade portal fantasy, where there are queer characters. And while it might not be in your face, and it's more about, the friendship and the development and everything, I still don't want to be like, well, why are you simply just, doing this? Oh, well, oh, kids and stuff like that and everything. It's like, well, around the age of 12 and up, kids do tend to experience different emotions and feelings. And, if their parents don't talk to them, their teachers are just like, well, no, that's this or whatever. Or other kids are basically, shunning them because their parents have shunned, what X, Y, and Z. Well, how would they simply understand and feel? They would just kind of just block it out. But when they pick up a certain book and be like, well, you know what? I can actually relate to this. I don't feel so alone. And I feel even so what I just said, that it's not for them. My books aren't for you. Okay, you can enjoy any other stuff. I'm not stopping you, but those books aren't for you. Okay, it's for the audience that actually wants those things, that actually feel those sort of things. So I'm just trying to just, just say screw it to anybody else who just doesn't accept me and my writing and my characters. There will be other people who, accept that and accept me.
I think for me, I've always grown up with my parents. I mean, my parents have always kind of been rebels in their own way. My dad has always been interested in like fantasy and sci-fi, but like he was also interested in like Bruce Lee kung fu movies and just like a variety of things that didn't connect at all. And when I was little, he was the coolest person in my mind. And then my mom, like she, I mean, for a long time, she was one of those ones that just like kind of, not to say it's bad or anything, but just like kind of thinking of the stigma of it. Like she would always like press her hair just like, every single day. And she was like one of the first people I knew that actually had the boldness to go natural, when there was not hardly anyone doing it. And she was just like rocking her fro. Like she was so happy and proud of it. And then when people would stare at her, because we lived in a mostly white town, like we lived in the middle of nowhere in Missouri. So a dark black woman walking around with her afro definitely stood out. But if anything, she was empowered by people being intimidated by her. She was just like, well, that's their problem. Fuck them. So I've just always kind of grew up with that. And at this point, just anything that people already have some kind of preconceived notion towards, I almost gravitate more towards it. I like feeling like I get under people's skin because I'm like, why? I mean, do you really have a good reason? Like, I like to challenge people. Like, you know, what makes this nerdy? What makes this geeky? What's wrong with it? I mean, I'm just kind of that kind of person. I like to challenge people, and that's just who I am. That's probably why I gravitated towards the genre.
I will say that I'm also very much in like the fuck it, this isn't for you, but it's for this group of people, and that's okay kind of camp. And for me, the fantasy stigma was also kind of always secondary. I knew going into writing that I really wanted to write asexual lead characters in partnered relationships because that was something I never got to see on the page until I was like 25, and it was very hard to not have anything to go off of up until that point. And so I really wanted to write the representation that I never got, both for myself, very selfishly, but also for people who were still looking for that. And so there's, of course, pushback from people who are saying, like, that's not an orientation. Like, who's going to need those stories? Like, who wants to read that? And I've kind of from the beginning been like, whatever, man, this isn't for you. This is for me. Like, if I want to write about like a very gentle fairy prince who's ace and has a horde of adopted goblin kids in the woods, like, that's for me. I'm going to. Me and the handful of people who enjoy that are going to be over here. You can go read your stuff over there. And I think that was really helpful in setting me up to kind of mentally push back against the fantasy stigma, where I was already very much like committed to this weird little niche of the writing world. And I'm happy to be there. And people who think it's silly are definitely just not going to dissuade me from being a part of it.
Nice. I definitely agree because, like, as a reader who is like, I'm fat, I'm non-binary, I'm indigenous, I'm queer, like, whenever I was a teenager, like, all of the popular fantasy books were very, like, skinny, neurotypical, allo cishet white. So I think that what y'all said about having to, like, carve your own space, I personally think that that contributes a little bit to the resurgence because readers who didn't get to see themselves in, you know, like, the Twilight heyday, you know, are now getting to see themselves because of people like you really putting in the work. So going off of that, was there any specific book or author that whenever you were reading, you know, that's really what inspired you to start writing in the genre? Like, was there anything that stuck out as like, this is my origin story moment?
Oh gosh. There's a lot, but I'm going to call out N.K. Jemisin because I feel like reading N.K. Jemisin really spoke to me being able to say, like, being able to write from a very Black perspective and being unafraid to do it. And, you know, there's not a lot of Black writers historically writing in fantasy and science fiction. Like, it just wasn't a thing. And so for her, and especially because her writing tends to kind of cross between science fiction and fantasy, and so it's this interesting interplay. And the other thing about her is that her writing is beautiful. And when I'm reading a story, I'm not just interested in the characters and the plot. I'm a super huge nerd, and I want to read beautiful sentences, and I want to learn how did you do that? How did you make me feel that way? I don't know this word, you know, or whatever. And the fact that her writing is beautiful as well as technical, as well as her world building is outstanding. And I thought, I can do that. I'm sure I can do that. Now, I'm not N.K. Jemisin, don't get me wrong. But what I mean is she's already carved this, you know, this road, this path. Like, I don't have to start from scratch. And so I'm very thankful for her, for the people who read her, to her agents and the publishers who, you know, who really supported her through that journey. Outside of that, you know, I mentioned Charles DeLint earlier, and reading him as a young person really was kind of like, I'd never seen magic in the real world until I read Charles DeLint. And it's definitely old school. It's definitely a gentler, quieter kind of magic. But those two authors, I think, is really what kind of pushed me into my current, you know, I've gone through an evolution of writing as most authors, I think, have. But where I am today, I think those two authors really contributed to that.
For me, I would say the two authors that kind of made me want to write contemporary fantasy were Jim Butcher and Holly Black. But like, Holly Black stories were the first ones where I saw queer characters. They were side characters, but it was still like, okay, I am allowed to, and that was even before I even knew I was queer. So it was an interesting. Those were definitely formative. And then when I was in high school, I was like obsessed with the Dresden Files, but when I look back at like the Dresden Files as an adult, and there's so much like problems with representation in those books that I wasn't aware of then. And actually, I moderated a panel about them where we like I won't get into that, but so there was a lot of elements about those kind of books that inspired me to write urban fantasy, but I also wanted to do it different. So I wanted, a kind of snarky, powerful character that's going to mouth off to the bad guys, kind of like how Harry Dresden is, but I wanted it to be, a non-binary teenager with mental health issues, not, some white cishet guy. And I, also loved how Holly Black had fairies and like, I don't know, I just loved like the atmosphere of her books. I also tried to like take some stuff kind of like that and infuse it. So I definitely had like two authors and two series that were what drew me into urban fantasy. And I definitely think those influenced my writing, but I also had this feeling like I want to do it different. I want to put the kind of representation that I've wanted to see, which is, non-binary characters, bi characters, ace characters. Like I wanted to put that kind of stuff into books, but have the kind of tone and atmosphere of the books that got me into urban fantasy to begin with.
I feel like because I didn't get into simply, where I am at the beginning, I didn't really didn't really have that kind of, whether it be cultural influence or that kind of favorite book author, or that kind of push me into writing, because I had a library of books, but I don't think I've never really had anyone just say, well, hey, have you checked this out? Because I feel like you would simply like this. And nowadays, there's a whole, fluctuating of, hey, check this author out. X, Y, and Z, if you like this, blah, 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 blah. And I just see that, hey, if you like anime, hey, if you like, magical girls, like, female characters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think in a way, I'm just gonna drift away from that for just a second. My pull into it was kind of self-inserting myself. My first self-insert was called The Adventure of the Teens. I was 11 years old when I made that, and my primary inspiration was Disney Channel. Was a big Disney person, Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, but definitely Disney. The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody's, the That's So Ravens, Philip Futures, all of them. And I kind of just made myself into the world of being a super spy, basically. And me and Dylan Close Browse, our talking robotic, dog that we found in the future, our dinosaur that we went to the past to go save, and and being led by our super spy leader, which I actually think Totally Spies kind of like gave me an inspiration, like later, or maybe I don't know. I think that came afterwards, but that has kind of led me to kind of like be crazy, with like adding this and going in here and that, and I guess later on for an actual like contemporary urban fantasy kind of series, I would have to kind of do Cassandra Clare and the Moral Instrument series. I feel like that was kind of like more of a sort of a pull into the direction of, well, you can still have all of this, the romance, the fantasy, in it, and still be in your world. So I've literally read all of the books, and that has kind of been a big, I guess, a step in the right direction. And then it just took off from there. So now I try reading, almost everything, and just from different people's perspectives. And I think nowadays it's going in a good way now, where I am now simply aware now, and that I can simply just accept, different things now.
I think for me, definitely it was Rick Riordan, the Percy Jackson series. Like that was my like introduction into reading fantasy that wasn't really old, like Narnia, or and then it wasn't. It was actually like the first book that I read that was like a thick book. Narnia, actually, my dad read it to us as like a bedtime story, but Percy Jackson was the first book that I read on my own. That was like thick book to me. Like I finished it in like 3 days. But Rick Riordan was definitely the first book that I read that made me want to write something similar. But similar to Amber, like N.K. Jemisin made me understand myself as a writer, because like I've always gravitated towards fantasy stories that had like a rich culture in them. Like Percy Jackson brought out, Greek culture, and then you had the Kane Chronicles that brought out Egyptian culture. I liked stuff like anime that brought out different themes of Asian culture. And for me as a writer, as a Black writer from the United States, I always felt this sense of longing for a kind of culture that I could base fantasy on, that I just felt so lost in, because, I just didn't have one. And I mean, especially not in like a very deep thematic sense, we definitely don't have, gods and goddesses and, fantasy creatures to go off of. There may be like little myths and tales here and there, but N.K. Jameson really helped me see, that she just like made it all up. Like she didn't base her world upon any kind of, existing culture. She just was like, fuck it, I'm making it myself. And that attitude really helped me define myself as a fantasy writer, and to, just continue what I have been, which is to continue to carve a path for myself. And reading her work, it was really empowering for me as a writer. So Rick Riordan helped me understand I wanted to be a writer, and N.K. Jemisin helped me understand the kind of writer I wanted to be.
I'm going to cheat a little bit and say that the Miyazaki films are actually what really helped me kind of figure out what kind of writer I wanted to be. He's a visual storyteller, so it counts. But I really liked his style of very gentle world building, where you're not given a list of rules and a list of like countries and different things you have to memorize. And a lot of the times in those films, things happen that really aren't explained, and you're just kind of supposed to go with it and accept that that's kind of part of just how the world works. I also really, really love the themes of characters coming together and inspiring each other to be better people, whether that's like a platonic relationship or a romantic relationship. I just really love that kind of connection between people. And I think that the way that he and his team kind of integrate quiet moments into those stories is really effective as a storytelling technique, where it's not action, action, action all the time. And I think in the West, I've definitely had like at least one teacher tell me in creative writing that like every scene has to like move the story forward. And I think that the Miyazaki films are a really nice example of like, that's not necessarily like something you have to do. Like you can just have a moment where these characters are just being themselves, or like being with their family, and like that has a purpose. It has a very rich purpose. It's just not like kind of pushing you into the next phase of the story. And I also, as a very visual person, appreciate like how the scenes look and how important the environment and the nature aspects are to a story. And that's something that I've really wanted to incorporate in my writing as well.
Awesome. So we are almost at time. So we're gonna do two like little quick rapid fire questions. As a reader, do you tend to pick things up in the contemporary fantasy genre, or do you like to separate that and read things outside of it?
I primarily read outside my genre, but I read almost everything. I have a wide variety of things on my Kindle at any given time.
I read a mix. I do read some contemporary fantasy, but I also read science fiction, epic fantasy. I've been reading a lot of middle grade and young adult lately. So as long as it has some speculative element, I'll read it.
I literally have physical books, Kindle books, and it is a big mix of both contemporary fantasy, middle grade fantasy. You know, if I just find something that's just just of interest and then it just speaks out to me, I'm gonna pick it up and simply read, regardless of even if it isn't fantasy. As long as it just is what the interest is and everything, and just I'm gonna pick it up regardless.
I read a lot of fantasy in general, contemporary fantasy, sci-fi, and but I recently have been expanding my genres. I try to read genres I don't usually pick up, like horror and contemporary and historical romance, just because I like to see different aspects of other genres and how it can help the way I write to be a little different.
I tend to gravitate to fantasy just as like my kind of home base, but I'll read anything from any genre. I'm usually governed more by tone and theme than the particular genre. And the upside is I work in a library, so I see like everything, and I can just have my pick of it.
Okay, and then last question, because I am a big recommender on this channel. That's kind of my thing. I want us to build a contemporary fantasy starter pack. So name a title that you think is very accessible for people who are trying to get into the genre. Mine's going to be A Lot Sway by Darcy Little Badger.
Does somebody else want to go? I need to think. No, please, if you have something, speak up.
I would recommend. I mean, it's not. I mean, it's from years ago, but I still feel like it's timeless. Percy Jackson, because like it perfectly makes like an average kid, Greek mythology, and fantasy woven in just like at the right time and presented like it's summer camp. So I mean, like, how can you get any better than
that? Just something I've read recently that I thought might be accessible to a new person to the genre is Legendborn. That was a YA book, but it was contemporary fantasy set on a college campus, but it also drew from some I don't know, it had a little bit of Arthurian legend drawn into it, and so I feel like it has some stuff that people are familiar with, but then it also had a separate side of the magic specifically drawn from Black culture, so it had I don't know, I felt like it had something that was familiar to me and then something that I needed to learn more about. So that's something I would recommend to people trying to get into urban fantasy.
I guess I would, for those who do kind of have want that anime sort of influence, the Effigy series. The first book was called Fate of Flames. Really reading from books 1 and 2, I was kind of addicted, and I kind of just read straight through, and I'm just like, oh, well, this hasn't really happened. And I see it in my head where I was picturing it like an actual show. I know we do that normally, but it was actually realistic, where I just said, oh, what's that show that I just watched? Oh wait, it was that book. But I feel like for those who want an actual sort of kind of power, like Powerpuff Girls, even just with a hint of anime influence, with a hint of just crime fighting girls sort of thing. And I feel like that would be. And then there's also A Blaze So Black. I'm waiting for the book to pretty much come out, I think, next year. But I feel like that would kind of pull, people of just, of course, any race, pull in too. And for those who kind of want to kind of get into middle grade, I feel like Amari and the Night Brothers would kind of be good, but still, you don't have to necessarily, oh, well, it's middle grade for little kids. No, it's not, okay? It's still good enough where you don't need to be 15 or whatever just to read it. It's just that good. Like the three just I said it's that good. I feel like that would kind of push people to be like, okay, this is interesting, and it's diverse enough where you can still, get a sense of like inclusion as well.
I can go. So I have three. I'll go through them really fast. Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas, if you haven't read that one already. Latinx author, Latinx main character. Trans author, trans main character. Loved the magic system. Loved the ghost love story. Thought it was really accessible and really easy to get into. Blaze Wrath Games by Amparo Ortiz, which is Puerto Rican author, Puerto Rican main character. A really great read alike if you're trying to get away from Harry Potter and you want like diverse and thoughtful representation. Lots of dragons, lots of magic, lots of intrigue. And then it's a young adult, no, not young adult, middle grade graphic novel called Snapdragon by Kate Lay, which I thought had a really cool, lots of creative diversity, lots of really cool, like quiet magic and an excellent, excellent setting.
I'll cheat a little bit, and I'm going to say, instead of a novel, I'm going to say, because I've been rereading it lately, the Fables graphic novels. I think they're great. I think they're an easy read. They're fun. You're familiar with the characters already, and it has a really nice blend of the fantastical and the real world.
Perfect. I'm so glad that I own all of these. So, okay, so that's all we have for today. I want to say thank you all for coming and joining me and having this chat. Thank you to Paula and everyone at the IBF for setting this up and making this possible. And yeah, the next panel should be starting soon, if not already. So make sure you go check that out. And everyone's socials and places you can follow them will be linked in the description. All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
me.
Bye.
Bye.